Hello, my name is Jeff Fuller. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel Special Forces officer from Haymarket, and I'm going to give you basically a top-level briefing on the results of our work so far on examining the capability of Prince William County Schools to prevent and respond effectively to an armed attack at one of our schools. It's important to note up front that although I'll tell you why we were concerned in the first place, but it's important to note that we're not looking to beat anybody up. We think that there's some things that could be done perhaps differently or worth examining. We don't have the inside information on what's going on both in the police department and the schools, although I recently sat in on a Safe Schools Advisory Council meeting that was quite informative, where they updated the members of that committee on plans that are underway, which include a significant number of new hires to help cover the elementary schools. So that was welcome news. But in any case, I hope that our purpose here is to provide insight that's from outside of the school division, outside the police department, from different set of eyes with different sets of background and experience that we hope you will find and the public will find useful. So we're not out to get anybody here. We hope that we can contribute to an improved, safe school division. Before we start, I think it's useful to put ourselves in the position of the Uvalde, Texas city and area leaders and citizens that they would be in about a week after the attack. What would the answer be to these questions? And how does that relate to us in Prince William County? Well, I think the first one is, would we have been able to prevent that attack? And if we failed to prevent it, would we be able to interdict and prevent the shooter from accumulating a large number of casualties? How can we dissect our capability of our policies and our capabilities to answer those questions? Well, that's basically what the analysis methodology that I've used here does. And is everybody happy with the risk picture that we have here? This briefing will basically follow this outline. I'll give you a little bit about how the concept works, the results of the threat analysis, risk management, etc. Why bother? Well, we started off with some concerns. For example, the Prince William County Police Department and the school division share responsibility for this. There is no single, what I would call unity of command, and as a military guy, that always makes me nervous. Doesn't mean it's a disaster, but it means that extra measures have to be taken to make sure that that can be overcome. With regard to the prevention side of the equation, I understand there is a limited threat assessment capability at the school division. I have been told it is a one-person level of effort. With regard to the response part of the equation, 98 schools, 20 security response officers who are basically full-time policemen, specially trained for that task. And they cover 15 high schools full-time and part-time 21 middle schools. And for elementary schools, there is no armed coverage, although there are some security staff from the school division that rotate through those schools. I would say overall the access control is moderate, and the hardening of the school from a number perspective is weak. And I would say overall the surveillance capability is weak. Why do probability risk management? Well, it's been my experience that this allows you to lay out and analyze your current capability based on policy plans, procedures, and capabilities, and then do assessment of cost and benefit in order to determine, are you happy with the results, or do you want to change something and assess it? And that's basically what you do. If you don't like the current results, you can check an alternative in terms of its effectiveness and cost and see if it's worthy of consideration. And then you inform the elected officials and the public, and you make sure that everybody's on board with whatever it is you come up with. No change, in other words, the status quo is a decision. I've recently read that Dr. McDade has announced that she's going to add 62 equivalent, basically unarmed security staff at the elementary schools. I think that will have a, improve prevention to some extent, although elementary schools are not the source of the shooters for the most part. That would be unusual. So I am not certain that the return on investment of that is going to be what you would really want. This is the team. I've been doing risk analysis, risk management, focused on terrorism, lone shooters, and whatnot for a long time. I'm working with Tim Weber, who's an FBI supervisory agent with 30 years of experience in all different aspects of this. And John Hahn, who's a current federal agent, and he's experienced not only in active shooter and school shooter analysis, but also solutions. And has actually worked that in support of the state of Florida. We were advised by Major General Mark Dillon, who's basically been very involved in education, and Paul Cibula is a senior principal systems engineer on command, control, communication, and tactical systems. And I know, by the way, did a security assessment for Supervisor Lawson some time ago. This was our plan. We're basically at the end where we're out briefing. It's important to emphasize that this is not a normal security assessment. We took our normal security assessment model and added a component of prevention before we got into the defeating of the attack or the response to the attack. And so basically we have taken a hybrid approach to analysis of the risk. And I'll show you just a little bit about that. In a pictorial form, we apply the concept that I've just described. We work it through 4 scenarios, which I'll show you. And we ask, did the prevention work? Did the current response work? If not, what are the casualties estimated? And on the right, you see the results that we've got from the 3 basic analyses that we did. For no program, that is no prevention or response program, we estimated 28 equivalent fatalities. For the current capability you have on the ground now, we estimated 19 equivalent fatalities. And for our reasonable best case, we got the number down to 5. So the analysis of school shooters from the 2002 study, post-Columbine, is that 80% experienced some kind of a major stressor. 70% had that going on for months or even years. And 38% experienced 5 or more stressors. They have problems coping with losses, failures. They often get into suicide ideation, and many report being bullied or persecuted. Drug use is common. They often attempt to involve other students in some capacity. 80% of their guns come from family members, either immediate or extended. And it's a very important point here. Many shooters leak their plans. And who to? Obviously, students. The U.S. Secret Service did another study in 2021, and they really started banging the table on how important it is to prevent the violence by intervening early with students before the rampage and understanding that students are often motivated because of grievances with classmates. Students at the school often know and must be able to report concerning any behaviors that are troubling that are displayed by their classmates. So they concluded that a robust threat reporting, assessment, and mitigation program, I'm just calling it threat assessment team, is critical. A little more on the School Shooter Initiative 2002. Out of 37 attacks they studied, 33% were stopped by non-law enforcement. That surprised me. The attacker stopped or left the school in 22% of the cases. There was a suicide in 13 cases. Law enforcement intervened in 27%, and a weapon wasn't fired in 8%. All of that, some of that was surprising to me. What was not surprising is the time of attack. 25% were resolved within 5 minutes, 25% within 15 minutes. Now, if you looked at the Uvalde case, it was well over an hour, as I remember. So the time from the time that the attack starts until it's stopped is really a critical number. Some trends with regard to attacks over time. The dark green is attacks with somebody killed. The light green is those with somebody injured. As you can see here, it went up until about 2007. Then it dropped down until about 2011. And then it started back up again. And I cannot explain, and I didn't see anything to explain why that dropped. But in any case, you can see overall, it's not a good trend. Discipline problems I thought were interesting. These are discipline problems reported between the 2009 school year and the 2019 school year. If you look at these, you can see that 3 of these things that they kept track of have gone down. Student bullying went down, sexual harassment went down, sexual harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity went down, but there was an increase in racial and ethnic tension cases, cyberbullying cases, and then this was really not surprising based on what I've heard, but the student verbal abuse of teachers went up significantly in that 10 years. Widespread disorder in classrooms almost doubled. And student acts of disrespect for teachers other than verbal abuse went up significantly. And this is basically similar. This reinforces anecdotal information I've heard from teachers since I've been looking into Prince William County schools. Some of the information on the age of the shooter is interesting. The most frequent age, is 15. The average age is 19.7. If you plot the age over time, as well as the number of equivalent fatalities, or VSL is what I reported here as, you can see that the 20 to 21-year-old age group is by far the most deadly. And again, that really doesn't come as a surprise if you think about it. But notice the attacker age, when it's down in the elementary school range, there's very few of those shooters. So your elementary schools are not generating the shooters. They're generating victims. This graph basically portrays the data from the perspective of the high school, the elementary school, schools that weren't characterized in middle school. It shows the average shooter age, the number of equivalent fatalities, and the number of attacks. And what I think you can see right away is that the high schools generate the largest part of the problem in terms of numbers of fatalities, numbers of attacks, and that the average age of high school shooters tends to be hovering around high school age. So clearly the high school is generating most of the shooters that attack the high school, and I think if you think about it, that makes sense. For elementary schools, I was interested to see that the average age of the attacker is much higher. So these are people who are coming from the outside and aren't necessarily carrying a grudge against somebody in that particular school, but has the notion of killing as many kids as possible in a horrific manner. These are the truly evil people. And then middle schools have a relatively small number of both fatalities and attacks. The one thing about the elementary school, if you'll notice, the equivalent fatalities in this case is 61 for all of those attacks, and the number of attacks is 41. What that says, in effect, is that those attacks are generating almost 50% more fatalities per attack. By far the worst of the four different categories. These two tables basically display the same data. It shows the school level, the average shooter age on top, equivalent fatalities total for that category of school, and the number of attacks. It's basically the same data I showed you on a previous slide. And then the second table below here shows the percentage in the first column, the percentage age average compared to the average age of the shooter, which is about 19.7, the equivalent fatality percent, and the number of attacks by percent. And in summary, as I mentioned before, elementary schools attract older shooters, about 1.5 of the average age of the shooters. And they have the highest equivalent fatality rate, as I mentioned earlier. For middle schools, they have the youngest shooters and the lowest effective equivalent fatality rate. High schools tend to be attacked by kids high school age, and they account for by far the most attacks and most fatalities. In order to do the kind of analysis here, we had to estimate the likelihood of the attack and the maximum loss. We used the Washington Post data to develop that. It turns out that there's 14 attacks average per year in 130,900 public K through 12 schools. If you apply that to 98 Prince William schools and you just use a 5-year period, that would be 1 chance in 19, or 5%, that a school in Prince William County over the next 5 years would have an attack. We came up with a different way to do this, and that was we simply asked, what if we have 1 attack in a 5-year planning period? And that would be 19 times more than the historical data, but it does allow you to answer the question, what if? The maximum loss is straightforward. We use a equivalent fatality of $10 million per. We estimated that the worst case is 28 equivalent fatalities based on the Columbine shooting. And that means the maximum loss in terms of dollar equivalents is $280 million. I mentioned we used 4 attack scenarios. These are the attacks we used as exemplars or scenarios against which we judged the capabilities that we postulated. In short, you can see here the age of the shooter, the average number of equivalent fatalities, and the age of the shooter, and whether they were a current or former student. And only in the case of Columbine, of all these cases, were there 2 shooters. So these are the things we analyzed. That's what the analysis database looks like. And by the way, we are happy to share that database with anybody that we trust who wants. This is just a walkthrough of what we assumed with regard to prevention and response. For prevention, there is certainly a threat assessment capability. It's, as I understand, of 1 full-time analyst. They now have a new anonymous tip line that has come into effect in this year, which sounds quite good. There is training for students, staff, and family with regard to tips and reporting and so forth. There's no mental health liaison, as I understand, and no scenario-based threat assessment training and exercises, which we would recommend. The threat assessment team is not integrated into the response training and exercise program as far as we can tell. The response capability for high schools is more robust because there's a full-time SRO in high schools. There's almost no technology. There is CCTV, but it's not monitored and it is not smart. There is limited access control, no door alarms, no walk-through metal detectors. And there's limited integration of exercises between the threat assessment side of the equation and the SRO slash the staff CSOs. Middle schools differ in that there's a part-time CSO at the middle schools, and the school division has security staff that rotate through and provides coverage. But a part-time CSO is not going to be as effective in establishing and building relationships as a full-time. And the shooter will definitely not plan on attacking when the armed CSO is there. Here's the prevention model we used. All of these actors, reporters, have to communicate their information up to the threat assessment team, who helps put together the mitigation services for the troubled child, and hopefully is able to mitigate that situation. These are the components. There's 4 components to prevention that we analyzed: detect, decide, engage, and mitigate. And that ends up being a probability of prevention estimate. It's important that the threat assessment team integrates all the tips from the staff, from professional service inputs, and develops and manages the mitigation measures. The assessment approach for current capabilities is, as shown here. We run the 4 attack scenarios through current prevention, through the current response planning and capabilities, estimate the number of casualties based on that analysis, and answer the question: do the current capabilities prevent and effectively respond to the attack scenarios? Now, that's a political judgment, basically. This analysis comes up with the answer in terms of the number of equivalent fatalities. The policymakers have to decide whether that's an acceptable level of risk. So this graph here illustrates the expected deaths over time for an incident. This isn't a hard and fast thing. It's just a template for kind of planning. And the model also has 4 components: detect, decide, engage, and defeat. And each of these have to be successful, or you are unsuccessful in your capability. And the critical factor is engagement, getting an armed responder to the situation in a timely manner. It may not take the shooter out immediately, but it will distract the shooter from whatever rampage he's on, at least to some extent. I'm going to show you just an illustration of the Columbine attack versus current capabilities for high school, middle school, and elementary schools. And this is the results of our analysis illustrated. So we determined that the prevent capability in high schools compared to elementary schools was 25% versus 9%. Why? Largely because SROs in high schools are basically engaged in identifying actively and mitigating children that are demonstrating some kind of a problem. On the response side of the equation, we estimated a 30% response capability for high schools and a 5% for elementary schools. So again, very significant difference based on, and then you combine those two, and for high schools you get an improved prevention of 16%, and overall a 35% improved capability or reduced equivalent fatalities. Well, this is not an eye chart, but a table that shows you a comparison of the results for all schools rolled together: high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. It's an important distinction to note that they're not all the same. If you look at the scores in terms of the prevent slash response risk on the far right, you'll see that the higher the score there, the worse the situation. That's the number of equivalent fatalities estimated based on both prevention and response. Now, if you follow along a line there to a result you don't like, you have to go back and ask yourself, what are those? And I've highlighted them in different colors. So the darker red or the darker green are the opposite ends of the spectrum. So red is bad, green is good. If you see red or orange, you have to ask yourself, is there something we're not doing that we could do that would improve that score? So, for example, for response, improve detection. In the case of the alternative, we provided for a smart CCTV system that you don't have to man and operate 24/7 with a bunch of eyes. You can have it capable of picking up anomalous information, even to include weapon configurations, and give the security folks and the principal or whoever you want in the school immediate notice. So smart CCT is an important way, for example, to improve. So let me just summarize the key things that made a difference between the current situation and the alternative one was armed SROs. They improve prevention because they are a focused security person focused on identifying and helping to remediate troubled kids. And that enhanced the enhanced proposal for threat assessment team capability is expected to significantly enhance prevention. So those are the kinds of things that made a difference between one and the other. And I'm going to break that down further in just a minute. So in this case, I'm just comparing the high schools with the elementary schools. On the top of the high school scores, on the bottom of the elementary scores. Note that the high school, even under the current prevention, was able to reduce expected fatalities down from 28 to 12. Whereas in the case of the elementary schools, the best that we could expect would be about 23 casualties, almost double that of the high school. And we'll talk about a little bit about that. Alternative one increases prevention and response using a straight line assessment like we did here. We have to recognize that the likelihood of an elementary school age shooter is relatively low, and I'll show you that data in a minute. So it's important that we have an armed response in elementary schools if you want to get those numbers down in terms of equivalent fatalities. Older kids have a better chance of resisting, running, and so forth, whereas elementary kids are basically, unfortunately, sitting ducks. So we put together a reasonable best case. This was totally random. Basically, we came up with what we thought was reasonable. We added 4 threat assessment analysts and case operators to the threat assessment team. We paid for enhanced student work and training and outreach on the TIP program, added a medical and mental health liaison to the threat assessment team, and then included the threat assessment team in the CRO and CSO staff training and exercises, and also into the response training and exercises. With regard to delay, we added state-of-the-art smart CCT detect technology that is designed to detect weapons and biometric capabilities such as facial recognition, a single point smart access control system with 100% of the doors alarmed and window fixed so that they can't be opened from the outside, and walk-through metal detectors. For defeat, we added 100 SROs to the middle and elementary schools, so we assumed a full-time armed person at each school. The cost, I don't want to belate this, but basically we estimated the cost of this. The equivalent fatality of 28 fatalities for the best case was reduced down to 5. So that's a return on investment of $230 million over that 5-year period. This is the cost we estimated for the program that we put in place. And as you can see, the return on investment was about $1.77 per dollar invested. And this is more interesting if you work a number of different alternatives and compare the return on investment of those. So our alternatives look like this. First, the current case gave us 19 fatalities. The first A1 was the best case, and that was 5 equivalent fatalities. If we only did the prevention of the best case, it would have been 13 equivalent fatalities. And the response only would have been 10 equivalent fatalities. So we think it's useful to kind of consider that if you just do prevention or you just do response, you're not going to have the effectiveness of an integrated prevention and response program. And then we suggest, why not do an added program that doesn't add a bunch of staff, but adds technology and adds the prevention, best case prevention program and hardening of the school division. We didn't analyze that. We'd be happy to if somebody wants to put that together for us. Our conclusions and recommendations are these. First, a robust shooter prevention program not only will have a huge return on investment in terms of preventing the catastrophe of a massacre, but every student that you save through that kind of intervention is not only a bunch of dead students, and in this case a dead shooter or a incarcerated for life shooter, but it also means these people could be saved for society. And I think that's like a double whammy. We believe that the improved detect, decide, and delay proposal that we made would make a 911 call more a viable option, because if you can delay the shooter, then your 911 call response has a chance of effectively intervening. Our recommendations are these. If the Prince William County Police Department and School Division is interested, we would be happy to analyze their actual current and best case capabilities or whatever alternative they want to look at. And I do think it's useful to break down and analyze several different alternatives. You can take that best case alternative and break out each of the components of it, for example, and then brief the responsible policymakers and the public. If you come up with a situation where the current situation isn't acceptable, these members of the team will be happy to help, advise, and assist in any way we can. Our goal is not anything more complex than being of service in the protection of the children of the school division. You see here, I show a link to this briefing so that you can download it and study it. And you also have my email here and cell phone. So I'm including some of the links to the resources we relied on. And with that, I'll say thanks for listening and go in liberty.